Good afternoon, everyone. This is February 16th, 2020. This is the torture report, and there is so much to unpack here, so much complexity. We have just reached a pivot point in the seige that I've been under for the past 2 years. For those who don't know me, I'm a peace activist that was a little too effective at garnering celebrity and getting people to unite who would normally not get along with each other. And the deep state government hates people like me. And so they've been hunting me in all sorts of ways for over a decade. And the latest abuse I've had to field from them was from this gang that they enlisted to crawl into these underground compounds beneath my rental properties, arm them with extremely dangerous electromagnetic chemical weapons, and while penetrating visual devices so they could shoot at me with these weapons that come up right through the floorboards like I'm a fish in a barrel, extremely painful, life-threatening quite often, and basically to try to suppress me and enslave and traffic me or destroy my life in any way possible. And they were given an unlimited supply of deadly chemical weapons from the Raytheon company. Fortunately, I'm extremely resilient and strong, and through passive resistance, I was able to hold out and stay alive and not capitulate or be crushed by them. And eventually, they ran out of their seed money. This was months ago, I think early October. And since then, they've been starving and destitute and contracting all sorts of illnesses. A lot of the illnesses from the weapons that they were given to them by the deep state, causing incontinence and chemical castration. I've heard someone has dysentery down there. And one of the most sinister aspects of these weapons is that they seem to drive the main shooters crazy, so that their minds are unhinged now. It's almost like they get some kind of weird endorphin when they point these weapons at me and shoot at me, which they do incessantly every waking moment of the day. They're shooting at me right now in the back. They back off somewhat when I'm doing these videos or on the phone to listen to what I have to say, and then they increase the assault once I'm off the video or phone. So anyway, there's in these underground bunkers these intercoms, and you can hear the difference of somebody speaking through an intercom versus hearing the voices of the people who are actually occupying these rooms. I'm sure you're aware of that sort of tinny mechanical sound that a voice takes on when it goes through an electronic device like that. And so for hours and hours of all, through the days and often in the nighttime, law enforcement has been speaking to these youths in their bunkers and trying to talk them out and to get out of this dangerous, what they came to say with increasing frequency was a very embarrassing situation for law enforcement, and that this is a state of emergency, and warning them how dangerous these weapons are. And to no avail. And the gang is now emaciated and ridden with lice and, vulnerable to frostbite. I heard somebody say their toenails are falling off. I heard somebody else say that their ears are frostbitten. And still they won't leave. The breakdown of the gang is there's basically two segments to the gang. There's these sort of two nationality Israeli-American family unit that's immediately under my home, with some adjacent rooms around. And it seems that there's a few of them are their kids, and then there's some other homeless American kids in the mix, about 8 or so individuals immediately under me. And then in the adjacent bunkers are Americans, and it sounds from when they're all screaming and hysterical that there's between 40 and 50 of those. And from what I learned from overhearing, a lot of them are affiliated with law enforcement, and maybe a few children of coal miners, and a handful of homeless as well. Most are sound under 20. Most are male. And there seems to be about 8, which are the really unhinged gang leaders that shoot at me incessantly. And as the gang ran out of money, more and more of their fellow gang members have been pleading for them to stop and give up, which they ignore. And during all this time, my nature is to try to be a communicator. And listening, I found out that a lot of these kids got caught up in the sweep and were very naive and ignorant as to what they were getting into. And once they realized what a disaster this was, started begging to be allowed to escape, and then realizing that they were not allowed to, and now realizing that they are as much a hostage as I am. And so I started communicating with them, trying to figure out what their mindset was like and see if I could build some bridges. And eventually I did, and I won quite a lot of loyalty from the smarter, younger kids that were, more forced into this and not of their own volition. And so I started just learning as much as I could. The war chemical company Raytheon is just funding them endlessly with these chemical weapons, so evil. And the intention, I was like a prototype, and if they could crush me, my will, and get me to be sort of a remotely viewed prostitute for them, that they would franchise this across our nation, enlisting more homeless boys who would eventually sicken and eventually probably get terrible cancers, because they use chemicals like radium, which is a radioactive isotope, extremely destructive to human tissue, especially when you're young. And so my persistence caused enough embarrassment in the deep state. It was no longer clandestine, as I spelled out through repeated videos what exactly was going on. And so they shut the program down last fall, and they told the gang to get out. But the gang at this point was too crazy, and they haven't left since. And so there's been this horrible impasse, and with law enforcement begging them to get out with no results. And then I started to grow weary of hearing the same rhetoric over and over again, and I started to not like what some of the things law enforcement was saying. I thought that they were being too intimidating to these very scared, paranoid gang members who, they have no security net. They know, they have said a cop taught me how to do this more than once. And so they were in fear and have been in fear of their lives if they were to walk out. But it just got to the point where, clearly, as the nights plunge down into 30 degrees and they have no heat down there, and those generators that pump oxygen, I learned from a vet, can falter and die, and then they could suffocate down there. And so I just started trying to help them strategize and just, say, get out no matter what. You don't want to just, rot to death and die of exposure down there. Now a filthy, smelly, disgusting dungeon. It's worth it to get yourself out. So I started posting some blogs and videos about that and talking to them directly down through the floorboards, and some started listening to me. And then as of Valentine's Day, it sounded from what they were saying that some of them were ready to try to get out. And at this point, the American branch of the gang had moved to more distant bunkers, so I couldn't really hear anymore what was going on in the American sector. But it sounded like 2 or 3 kids and possibly the mother were going to try to make a break for it on Valentine's Day. And so I tried to help them get emotionally and mentally prepared as I could. And one genius kid said he found a fire extinguisher to blast anybody who was going to, try to intimidate him or prevent him, from the other side to get out. And then the following morning, I heard one of the more evil gang leaders, which is this Israeli guy immediately under me, say, "Where's Michael?" And the mother said, "I don't know. I think he got out." And I was like, whoa, after all this time, somebody got out. It was just like, that part in Room, when the helicopter spots the mother and son trapped by that psychopath for years in that little hut in the back of his yard and property. And then I heard I wonder who went out with him, from one of the kids immediately under me. And so at that point, I knew somebody from the American side joined forces with him. And I don't ever remember hearing him talk or planning with anybody but the boys immediately underneath my bunker. And so I started thinking, there's some American that just kind of jumped on board at the last minute to walk out with him. And I was so grateful at that point that, that this one, who I learned for the first time February 15th, was named Michael, didn't go out alone. And then I started to think, well, who do I know, who went out with Michael? And I was trying to tune in, and there's this one guy that I dubbed him Thor. I don't know his real name, but he sounds like a big, powerful, muscular guy with a deep, loud voice, which was very distinctive. And I didn't hear Thor that evening or the next morning, and that was tremendously exciting for me, because at some point I began to think that probably Thor was embedded. He was like some law enforcement affiliate. He sounded older and more mature and more commanding. And so I started to think he was some kind of embedded law enforcement. And that just seemed so exciting. And I made that post about how, I had been talking and kind of referencing, time to be a hero. And it just seemed like both those boys just decided it was their moment to be heroic, and hopefully in their walking out, make it possible for the rest of the gang to shed their fear and anxiety of the unknown when they go out there. And so there was all this uncertainty for a while, well, are they all right? What happened? And then I heard over law enforcement, the intercoms, I heard yesterday, both boys are safe. And I was like, God, I hope so. I hope so. It's hard I've been at odds with law enforcement for so long, and I, knowing that some of them are corrupt and helped to instigate this, and so who knows, what happened. But I started kind of putting two and two together and thinking about what happened. And so I put up a theory last night on Facebook of what I think happened. And I believe, there was this one moment when Thor, he sounded so frustrated and despairing, and he was saying, some months ago, I think it was like end of October, get law enforcement down here, get the police down here to clean these guys out. And it sounded, unlike any of the other gang members, like he was kind of in command and able to command other law enforcement. And he only did that once, and he never did again after law enforcement didn't come in. But it kind of just pegged him for me as he's some kind of insider, some kind of peer of law enforcement, or he wouldn't have been talking to them that way. And then, in the ensuing months, it's like he sounded like a guy that could muscle his way out of any situation if he wanted to, but he wasn't, and he was just imploring over. He sounded like one of my allies, that, I had flipped him, and that, he was clearly like extremely disgusted with what the gang was doing at this point, and would spend hours just screaming at the shooters over in his compound to stop. And restore my freedom and humanity, and get out of there. So what I think happened, and I've heard some stuff today to bear it out, is that Michael was incredibly brave because he went alone, not expecting anybody to help him, leaving behind any sort of security and relationship from this side of the compound. And I think what happened is Thor was listening and reading what I was saying to the boys and how they were responding, and he was starting to think there might be a showdown here, and people are going to get hurt and killed if I don't step in somehow. And I think he made the decision that if anybody from this side or any of the other boys were going to try to break out, that he would offer support for them. And how unfortunate it was only one, but I really think in retrospect one was enough. And I think he surmised that as well. And my guess is that as Michael appeared, Thor said, I'm going out with you, and I'm going to make sure that you're safe. And I think that he had enough authority amongst the American gang that they wouldn't get in Michael's way if Thor had his back. And so I think what happened is that I believe, and I think law enforcement is bearing this out, because after I wrote that blog last night, I heard today she was right about what she wrote in that blog. So I think that Michael's life was at risk because maybe he's an undocumented immigrant. I think kids that get brought into this type of deep state clandestine program are seen as expendables. And if they stay underground and die there, butts get covered, and the status quo corruption can continue. But to have one scrawny kid walk out and suddenly he goes from clandestine to, you can't deny there's this starving, emaciated kid suddenly appearing at the surface. I suspect that there were some higher ups that ordered the police to kill Michael when he walked out, to just kind of snuff out that whole can of worms that would happen of this child, clearly a hostage, surfacing. So what I think happened, I think Thor walked out in front of him and used his body as a human shield and I think that he knew the officers, possibly, who were out there waiting, and that he put himself in the way so that they couldn't shoot Michael until the situation was diffused and both were taken into custody. And just to, I was languaging about this, so the gang was overhearing my thoughts about this today, and a little while ago I heard he was willing to take a bullet for him. And so, this is just so amazing. And and then after that, about an hour or so, I had been saying, you need to get Michael or whoever Thor is on the intercom so that these kids know that that they're safe and alive. And about an hour or so after I heard he took a bullet for him, or maybe it was afterwards. I can't quite remember the order, but Thor came on the intercom. And he sounded his usual fierce self, and he said, you got to get out of there. she has the gift of prophecy. And he said, stop acting like you're all on death row down there, get out. And I am certain now, if Thor was willing to take a bullet for Michael, he would not have gone back on those intercoms once he was out to tell the other kids it's okay to get out. I think honor would prevent him from doing that, given how courageous and the fact he was willing to risk his life for Michael. And I think now that the cat's out of the bag, he's now enabled the scenario that everybody can get out, and they're going to be treated fairly and justly because he got Michael out. And so this is so huge, and I hope it lasts. There were so many barriers to scare those kids from walking out. And I hope that they see all the permutations and the angles of why so many of those questions that they had not had answered for months have now been answered. You can walk out and you're going to live. You'll be taken into custody and you'll be taken care of. You'll get three square meals a day, and you'll get a place to sleep and medical care if you need it. I cannot imagine Thor risking his life for Michael and this not being true for everybody else now. So thank you, everybody who's flipped hearts and minds to prioritizing the survival here, even if your own futures are jeopardized. And I pray that we can move on from this time of tragedy in our American civilization. And I have so many allies walking by my window as I'm taping this, so many families walking by showing their support in their colors of the social experiment. So grateful for all of you as well for creating this sort of vessel of saying to these kids, you're not going to be alone and you'll be treated fairly and justly. So please, please, please walk out.